If one carefully studies the history of the world economy, one can notice the same pattern that invariably repeats over many centuries. This is not chaos, but a strict, almost mathematical rhythm that most people prefer to ignore for the sake of their own peace of mind. There is a specific moment in every economic cycle when the decision to leave capital alone, simply preserving it in its pristine form, ceases to be merely a conservative strategy and turns into an act of slow suicide. This is a fatal choice, capable of wiping out the results of a decade of grueling, honest labor overnight. We are rapidly approaching one such critical point in 2026, and this is not another prediction by a market prophet or reading tea leaves. It is the cold, logical consequence of fundamental cycles that govern our reality, whether we like it or not. Today, I intend to dissect the reasons why keeping your funds under a proverbial mattress, in traditional savings accounts, or even in bank certificates, will become the worst financial decision you can make in the next 2 years. History is the cruelest and simultaneously the most effective teacher. And today, it is literally screaming a warning at us that only a few hear. To survive the coming storm, we will have to accept one simple and extremely unpleasant truth. Money is an illusion. I say this not as a philosopher or theorist. I assert this as a practitioner, relying on measurable and undeniable facts. The dollar you hold in your hands today has nothing in common with the dollar you had in 1980. It is not even equal to the dollar you earned in 2001. And it will certainly not be equal to the dollar that will end up in your wallet by 2030. Numbers do not know how to lie, unlike politicians and bank clerks. If you had set aside $100,000 in 1980 and kept it completely untouched, today the purchasing power of that impressive sum would have shrunk to a pitiful $30,000. Your money did not disappear physically. No one stole it from your safe under the cover of night. Something much more sophisticated happened. The real value of this capital was systematically and ruthlessly eroded by the system itself. This is the first great cycle, the mechanism of which has been launched anew. You must realize the nature of the process that professionals call monetary debasement. Every time the architects of the global system face crises, destructive wars, global pandemics, or deep recessions, they resort to the same proven tool. They simply print new money. This was the case during the Great Depression. It happened during World War II. This scenario was implemented in 2008 and repeated on a truly colossal scale during the pandemic of 2020. Just think about this fact. Between 2020 and 2022, the United States brought into existence more paper currency than in its entire preceding history. More than 240 years of the American monetary system's path were eclipsed by the volume of emission in just 2 calendar years. The consequences of this tectonic shift are only beginning to manifest, and 2026 will be the moment when ignoring them will be physically impossible. To understand why this date is a point of no return, it is necessary to disassemble the structure of the economic machine itself. Imagine the world economy as a colossal clockwork mechanism where each gear is responsible for its segment: productivity, credit, inflation, employment. When these parts work in perfect resonance, we observe stable growth and confidence in tomorrow. But when one of the key gears deforms or begins to spin at an abnormal speed, the balance of the entire system is disrupted. Over the last 4 years, several critical mechanisms have been accelerated artificially through unprecedented monetary and fiscal stimulus measures. The credit gear spun at the limit of its capabilities, with interest rates close to zero. The consumer sector was pumped with direct liquidity through stimulus payments. The liquidity gear received a powerful impulse from asset purchase programs by central banks. Now we have come right up to the moment of inevitable adjustment. And in every such historical transformation, one ruthless rule applies. Real assets retain their essence, while paper promises turn to dust. By real assets, I mean that which retains its fundamental utility, regardless of how many zeros are drawn on banknotes. These are shares in truly productive companies. This is land and concrete. This is raw materials and precious metals. Paper money, bank deposits, low-yield bonds, and stacks of cash are doomed to slaughter. The chasm between these two categories in the coming years will become truly brutal. The time of linear, safe accumulation of dead numbers on a screen has approached its logical finale. Let me explain to you the true nature of inflation, as you have likely never thought about it. Most are accustomed to perceiving inflation as some kind of natural disaster, an annoying rise in prices at gas stations or grocery stores. This is a dangerous misconception imposed on you by those who extract maximum benefit from this process. In reality, inflation is not just price tags creeping up. It is a finely tuned, systemic, and absolutely legal mechanism for redistributing material wealth from those who hold paper to those who own real assets. In this food chain, there is no place for sentiment. Here, there are only predators standing at the source of the money flow, and victims picking up crumbs on its periphery. To understand how you are being robbed live on air, you need to trace the path of freshly printed capital. When the government decides to launch the printing press, these new billions and trillions do not materialize magically in your bank accounts. They enter the economic fabric through the circulatory system of the financial sector, through the largest banks, investment funds, and transnational corporations. And this is where the main secret of power lies. Those who are in immediate proximity to this primary source of new liquidity, institutional investors, and the financial elite, get the opportunity to use this fresh money to buy assets before the market has time to react to their excess. They buy up shares in promising companies, real estate, and raw material resources at old, not yet corrected prices. At this moment, a powerful release of dopamine occurs in their neural networks. This is the anticipation of dominance, the realization that they are ahead of time. While this money slowly seeps down through the layers of the economy, its real purchasing power begins to fade rapidly. By the time this flow reaches you, wage workers, mid-level specialists, or pensioners on fixed incomes, prices for essential goods have already managed to soar. You feel only the consequences: more expensive housing, electricity bills, and supermarket receipts that get longer every month. You had no opportunity to protect yourself because you were last in this line for the illusion of wealth. This process has a specific historical name: the Cantillon Effect, in honor of the economist Richard Cantillon, who dissected this mechanic back in the 18th century. But you don't need to memorize academic terms to feel the practical result of this quiet expropriation on yourself. When you allow your funds to sit idle during periods of aggressive monetary emission, you are effectively voluntarily donating your well-being to those smarter and faster than you. This is an act of financial donation where your blood is your purchasing power, which you saved for years through sweat and deprivation. The biology of this process is as cruel as its economy. While icy calm and strategic calculation reign at the top of the pyramid, cortisol levels rise at the bottom. The stress hormone becomes a constant companion to those who see the fruits of their labor turn into nothing. It is a feeling of constant pursuit of an elusive horizon where you work more but can afford less. Your nervous system registers a threat to survival, depriving you of the ability for long-term planning and forcing you to make impulsive, emotional mistakes. You start skimping on quality of life, on education, on your children's future, not understanding that the very structure of the system is designed so that you remain in this state of perpetual deficit. Let's look at the dry facts for the period from 2024 to 2026. Even if official reports whisper to you about controlled inflation around 3% or 4%, the reality you feel with your skin dictates completely different conditions. Real inflation, hidden in the cost of a square meter of housing, in the price of fuel, and in a basket of basic food products, is substantially higher. Over the last 3 years, the cost of housing has risen by 25%. Food products have become 20% more expensive, and the energy sector showed growth of 30%. This means that if you held $100,000 in a passive state during this cycle, you effectively lost $20,000 to $25,000 of your real-life force. This money didn't just depreciate, it was siphoned into the pockets of those who recognized the rules of the game in time. Many comfort themselves with the hope that this is a temporary phenomenon, that the market will stabilize and everything will return to normal. This is dangerous infantilism. If you understand the true incentives guiding those at the levers, you will understand their inevitable behavior. The incentives of 2026 create conditions for a perfect storm in which the price of inaction will become exorbitantly high. The American national debt has already crossed the $33 trillion mark and continues to grow exponentially. Just servicing this debt, simple interest payments, consumes more than $1 trillion a year from the federal budget. This creates a vicious circle. Even without introducing new social programs, the government requires more and more currency simply to pay old bills. The only path for them is to continue printing dollars, thereby tightening the noose even harder around the necks of those who keep their savings in paper. In this system, honesty and thrift, in their traditional understanding, turn into a vice punishable by poverty. The systematic destruction of the middle class is not a side effect. It is a mathematical necessity for maintaining the life of a dying debt model. History does not just repeat itself. It rhymes with the grace of an executioner, preparing the scaffold for those who did not learn its previous lessons. To make you realize the scale of the catastrophe we are approaching in 2026, I want to tell you the story of two families from the Chicago suburbs, the Martinezes and the Thompsons. In 1970, this era, so frighteningly similar to our current reality, was just beginning its destructive dance. Both families possessed capital of $50,000. By the standards of those times, this was an impressive sum, a foundation on which a whole life could be built. But it was at this moment that their paths diverged, predetermining the fate of several generations. The Martinez family chose the path society calls prudent. They decided to leave the money safely in a savings account at a bank that brought them 5% per annum. On paper, it looked like the perfect plan. Stable income, a complete absence of market volatility, and the sweet illusion of control. They went to sleep with a sense of duty fulfilled, unaware that their safety was merely a form of slow financial dementia. Every morning their cortisol was normal, while inflation quietly and methodically sucked the life out of their savings. Their neighbors, the Thompson family, succumbing to the influence of a relative who understood the deep mechanisms of the economy, took a risk that seemed like madness from the outside. They distributed their $50,000 among shares of productive enterprises, real estate objects, and precious metals. In the eyes of the community, they were adventurers playing with fire in an era of uncertainty. Let's fast forward to 1980. 10 years later, the Martinez family discovered $81,000 in their account. Growth was 62%. In any other reality, this would be considered a success, were it not for one detail. Cumulative inflation for this period reached 112%. Their $81,000 in 1980 allowed them to buy less than half of what they could afford with their $50,000 at the beginning of the decade. They worked for 10 years, denied themselves excesses, saved every cent, and ended up twice as poor. This is a typical pattern reproduced every time we enter protracted inflationary cycles. The Thompson family ended the same period with assets valued at $195,000. They didn't just preserve their purchasing power, they tripled their real wealth, while their neighbors drowned in a swamp of depreciating paper. This is not just a parable, it is an illustration of how inflation works as a mechanism of forced wealth transfer. But to see the extreme manifestation of this law, we must look into even darker corridors of the past, into Germany of the 1920s, during the times of the Weimar Republic. There, the government, backed against the wall by war reparations and internal debts, began printing money with the fury of the doomed. At first, ordinary people keeping German marks in bank accounts considered themselves the height of prudence. But when the speed of the printing press exceeded the speed of the human mind, the mark began to lose value so rapidly that people needed whole wheelbarrows filled with paper just to buy a loaf of bread. In this agony, only those who owned real things survived: shares, land, gold, and even basic goods like fuel. Those who believed in the sanctity of state obligations and banking figures were completely destroyed. I am not claiming that hyperinflation of the Weimar model awaits the United States in 2026, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged. With excessive creation of money supply, real assets become a shield, and paper money a sentence. When the money supply grows faster than the quantity of goods and services, a great redistribution occurs. It is not accomplished through open robbery or confiscation, which could cause a riot. It happens through the quiet, relentless mechanism of inflation, which punishes conservative savers and rewards asset owners. Those who cling to outdated concepts of financial security discover that their definition of security was actually the greatest risk of all possible risks. True protection is ensured not by the absence of risk, but by a deep understanding of how to manage it in a world where the rules of the game have been changed forever. The time of passive waiting in the shadow of paper walls has passed. 2026 will be the moment when this wall finally collapses under the weight of printed trillions. If you understand the true incentives of the system, you can predict its behavior with millimeter precision. Those who manage global processes are not hostages of accidents. They are hostages of mathematical inevitability, which they themselves created. By 2026, these incentives will form a perfect storm, turning any procrastination into financial suicide. We have entered a zone where every decision of power is dictated not by a striving for prosperity, but by an animal instinct for survival at your expense. To realize the scale of the looming shadow, we must dissect 4 fundamental factors that make the printing press the only available cure for a dying colossus. The first incentive, the most obvious, and simultaneously the deadliest, is the debt loop tightened around the neck of American statehood. The national debt has already crossed the unthinkable mark of $33 trillion, and this figure grows exponentially, ignoring any attempts at political containment. But the horror lies not in the sum itself, but in the cost of servicing it. Just interest payments on this debt already consume more than $1 trillion a year from the federal budget. Imagine a structure that spends 1 trillion units of its life force simply to have the right to exist one more day without creating any added value. This means that even without launching new ambitious programs, the government vitally needs more and more new currency simply to pay interest because it is already indebted. The math here is merciless. The only way to get this money without causing an immediate social explosion is to continue printing dollars, diluting the value of every cent in your pocket. The second incentive is biological in nature, and therefore absolutely inevitable. We are observing an unprecedented aging of the population, creating colossal fiscal pressure on the entire system. Every single day, more than 10,000 Americans celebrate their 65th birthday, becoming full-fledged claimants for Social Security payments and medical care. This demographic shift will continue for the next 15 years, turning into a giant vacuum cleaner sucking resources out of the budget. These are mandatory expenses that grow automatically, obeying only the laws of time and biology, not the will of politicians. The system is obligated to pay, but its treasury is empty, and the number of those filling it with their labor is steadily shrinking. The only exit from this demographic trap becomes another portion of freshly printed paper, which will be issued as fulfillment of social obligations, although its real value will trend towards zero. The third horseman of this apocalypse is geopolitical rage. Competition with China and Russia is no longer a subject of cabinet discussions. It is a harsh reality forcing the system to spend astronomical sums on the military machine and updating critical infrastructure. Regardless of which political force holds the keys to the offices, national security expenses are considered sacred and untouchable. In a world where hegemony is questioned, saving on armaments is tantamount to capitulation. This is an endless arms race requiring trillion-dollar injections that cannot be extracted from taxes without strangling the remnants of the living economy. Again and again, the system will turn to the only source of energy it has left: endless emission. Finally, the fourth incentive, about which they prefer to speak in whispers, is the quiet agony of the banking sector. Hundreds of regional banks across the country today resemble the living dead. They are sitting on colossal losses in their bond portfolios, acquired in times when interest rates were artificially suppressed. As soon as these losses become apparent, and this will inevitably happen in the coming cycle, the government and central banks will have to intervene again. They cannot allow the system to collapse, because the fall of one brick will cause a domino effect. The rescue will look like another act of mercy paid for from the printing press. All these four vectors point to the same spot. In 2026, the volume of money supply will increase with such fury that any attempt to preserve capital in its paper form will become an act of voluntary expropriation. You are told that security is numbers in a banking app. But the truth is that these numbers are merely evidence of your participation in someone else's debt. The more currency is thrown into the system, the less your time, your labor, and your dreams preserved in these paper promises are worth. Those standing at the levers understand this perfectly. They do not hoard dollars. They hoard assets that these dollars allow them to buy for a pittance from those who still believe in the sanctity of a savings account. 2026 will be the moment when this erosion of values becomes visible to the naked eye, even to the most apolitical layman. The mechanism is launched, and it knows no pity for those who prefer to remain in their comfort zone while the walls of their shelter turn to dust. Many amateurs mistakenly believe that diversification is a way to earn an extra few percent of yield or a fun game of collecting various financial instruments. This is a dangerous illusion. In the world we have built by 2026, diversification is not a strategy for enrichment. It is an engineering plan for your personal bunker. It is the architecture of a shelter that must withstand when the inflationary fire turns paper cities to ash. You are building not capital, but a fortress, and every brick in its foundation must possess physical mass and undeniable value in any possible reality. When the sky is covered with clouds of monetary madness, your only protection is owning what I call primary essence. We are talking about real assets. These are things that retain their fundamental utility and significance, regardless of how many zeros central banks decide to draw on their banknotes. At the core of this strategy lies the understanding that in conditions of systemic chaos, it is not those with the most promises to pay who survive, but those who control resources and means of production. The key concept here is pricing power, a company's ability to shift the increase in its costs onto the shoulders of the consumer without losing demand. This is a biological law of economics. If you produce something without which a person cannot live tomorrow, energy, basic food products, or access to critical technological infrastructure, you possess absolute power. Your shares in such enterprises physically cannot depreciate to zero because they represent a share in the real life support process of humanity. Based on the principles we dissected earlier, I will outline the structure of this financial bastion for you. Remember, these are not just tips. These are educational principles you must adapt to your scale of personality. Never put all your resources in one basket. But far more importantly, never leave them in a basket that has long since rotted and is falling apart before your eyes. This rotten basket is paper money. Your defense protocol should look as follows. 40% to 50% of your portfolio should consist of shares of top-tier companies possessing that very pricing power. These are giants of the consumer sector, energy corporations, and technological empires with closed ecosystems from which it is impossible for a user to exit. 20% to 30% should be directed into the real estate sector, whether direct ownership or real estate funds controlling prime locations. Land and concrete in key spots of the planet are tangible value that cannot be printed on a printer. Next, 10% to 15% must be converted into commodities and precious metals. Gold brings no dividends, but it has been the perfect lie detector for paper currencies for 5,000 years. About 5% is worth keeping in bonds indexed for inflation. This is your bridge across the chasm of currency debasement. And only 10% to 15% can you afford to leave in the form of liquid cash. This volume is sufficient to cover emergency needs and lightning-fast use of new opportunities, but insufficient for inflation to inflict mortal damage on you. In this new world, you must be selective to the point of cynicism. Avoid companies burdened with colossal debts. In an era of high rates, they will be the first victims of the cleansing fire. Stay away from producers of secondary goods that people will give up at the first serious drop in living standards. Your fortress is built on a foundation of needs, not desires. Remember that market volatility is merely loud but temporary noise, while inflation is the quiet but guaranteed death of your capital. Fluctuations in stock or gold prices may cause spikes in your cortisol, but this is merely psychological discomfort. The price of entry into the game. The real tragedy unfolds when you, striving for illusory peace, leave your funds idle, allowing the system to systematically suck the life out of them. In 2026, the choice will become obvious. Those who continue to believe in the sanctity of bank deposits and the stability of state promises will discover that their safety was the most expensive mistake of their lives. True protection requires movement, decisiveness, and readiness to own physical reality. Your portfolio must consist of what people will buy, even if tomorrow seashells become the currency. The transition from cold theory to physical action is that very moment where most candidates for preserving their capital are weeded out by natural selection. I have seen this hundreds of times. People possessing brilliant intellect and deep understanding of market mechanisms turn out to be paralyzed by their own inability to pull the trigger. They fall into the trap of searching for the perfect solution, wasting precious months polishing strategy, while inflation devours their life force every second. You must grasp once and for all, in the conditions of the tectonic shift of 2026, no perfect choice exists. There is only a choice that is either better or worse than passive waiting for the end. Doing something imperfect today is an act of supreme financial valor compared to doing nothing in anticipation of perfection. Your neurochemistry is your main enemy at this stage. Fear of loss blocks the rational parts of the brain, forcing you to cling to the familiar, albeit rotten, haven of cash. You convince yourself that you are waiting for a market drop or a moment when inflation slows down to exit cash on favorable terms. But while you wait, every day lived turns your savings into dust. Waiting is also a choice, and in the current cycle, it is the most expensive choice possible. True determination has nothing to do with recklessness. It is a cold execution protocol divided into stages, excluding emotional outbursts. My transition protocol implies gradual implementation of changes over 6 or 12 months. You should not dump all your liquidity into the market in one day, succumbing to impulse. Instead, you systematically transfer your assets, 25% per month, from the danger zone to the protection zone. This reduces the risk of bad entry and allows your psyche to adapt to the new reality of ownership. If your goals lie beyond a 5-year horizon, market volatility should be perceived by you not as a threat, but as natural system noise. Short-term fluctuations are the price you pay for long-term immunity against inflation. However, If part of the funds will be needed by you in the next 2 or 3 years, maintaining a conservative reserve remains a necessity, even if it is sacrificed to devaluation. You pay this tribute for liquidity at a critical moment. One of the most dangerous traps is attempting to bet everything on one card. I have seen those who, realizing the power of gold, converted their entire fortune into it, or those who, blinded by historical stock returns, forgot about other layers of reality. Your task is not profit maximization, but survival and increasing purchasing power at a strictly controlled risk level. True capital architecture requires regular review. Every 6 months, you are obligated to conduct rebalancing, ruthlessly trimming what has grown too much and buying more of what has temporarily dipped. This forces you to act against the crowd, selling high and buying low. It is a mechanical process devoid of emotion, like the work of a surgical robot. Since we do not possess the gift of absolute foresight, we are obligated to prepare our portfolio for various scenarios that may unfold in 2026. The first and most likely scenario is permanent moderate inflation at a level of 4% to 6% per year. In this case, your balanced diversification strategy will ensure reliable protection without excessive nervousness. But what if geopolitical pressure or fiscal mistakes lead us to inflation of 7% or 10%? In such a reality, your share in real assets and commodities must be immediately increased. This is a transition to survival mode in fire conditions. There is also a less likely but extremely dangerous scenario, a deep recession capable of causing temporary deflation. It is precisely for this that you keep 15% to 20% of your portfolio in liquid instruments, diversified funds, short-term bonds, or cash. This is liquidity, your strategic reserve, allowing you to extract colossal benefit from moments of mass panic when quality assets will be sold for a pittance. And finally, we cannot rule out the return of the nightmare of the 70s, stagflation, combining high inflation with zero economic growth. In this scenario, utility companies, real estate investment trusts with long-term contracts, and precious metals become the true kings. Every action you take must consider taxes and transaction costs. A theoretically flawless strategy can become unprofitable if it does not account for the appetites of fiscal authorities. Implementing protection is not a one-time event, but a continuous management process. You must become the architect of your well-being, regularly inspecting the foundation of your fortress. Those who seek passive peace will be crushed. Those who accept volatility as an ally and discipline as law will pass through 2026 not only preserving their legacy, but multiplying it at the expense of those who chose to remain in ignorance. The time for reflection is exhausted. The era of pure execution is arriving. Now that you have realized the scale of tectonic shifts, the time has come for utmost honesty with yourself. The first step to saving your future is a complete and ruthless inventory of where your resources are located today. You must clearly see how much paper is stuck in checking and savings accounts, what share of capital is locked in bank certificates or bonds with negligible yield, and what part is really working in investments or real estate. The time has come to define your planning horizon for each segment and, based on your risk profile, fix the target asset allocation. You are obligated to decide what percentage of your life will be converted into each asset class and what your minimum reserve for survival in chaos conditions is. This process does not tolerate fuss. Changes must be implemented gradually, 25% per month, to minimize the risk of market timing. But remember, every decision you make, just like its absence, has its price. Investing in real assets is fraught with obvious costs: market volatility, risk of temporary losses, complexity of managing taxes and commissions. However, inaction and keeping money in a passive state are also taxed, and this tax is far more dangerous. It is guaranteed inflation, lost opportunities, and the risk of final monetary debasement. The question is never about avoiding costs. The question is what price you prefer to pay consciously. The price of inflation is the quiet, but absolutely inevitable death of your capital. Every month, every year, your purchasing power decreases like sand in an hourglass. The price of market volatility, on the contrary, is loud and demonstrative, but it is temporary in nature. There are bad years, there are good years, but the long-term vector is always directed toward preserving and multiplying real value. For the overwhelming majority of people whose goals extend beyond 3 or 5 years, the costs of inflation ultimately turn out to be incomparably higher than the discomfort of market fluctuations. You must make this choice consciously, not allowing negligence or primal fear to dictate conditions in your life. History teaches us that periods of colossal monetary emission invariably end with an era of massive wealth redistribution. This is not a question of political preferences. It is a dry mathematical pattern. When an excess mass of currency chases a limited quantity of real goods and services, prices are doomed to rise. When this growth outpaces the yield of conservative instruments, a quiet transfer of material wealth occurs from cautious savers to asset owners. This robbery is not accomplished through direct seizure or physical theft. It is carried out through the invisible but relentless mechanism of inflationary erosion. In the coming years, you will see this process at its climax. Those who manage to recognize the rules of the new game in time and prepare will not just preserve their legacy, but substantially strengthen their positions. Those who continue to cling to archaic notions of financial security will discover with horror that their striving for peace was actually the greatest risk of all possible risks. Genuine security never lay in avoiding risks. It was always the result of a deep understanding of their nature and competent management. And the main risk of 2026 is not a drop in stock indices. It is your complacency and readiness to watch the value of your labor systematically turn into nothing. This is not fortune-telling, but the logical finale of economic cycles that rule our reality. The choice always remains yours, but you must understand that the decision to do nothing is also a choice. And in 2026, it will be the most expensive choice in your biography. History will once again act as a stern examiner for those ready to learn its lessons. In this grand selection, only one question remains. Will you be among those who mastered knowledge, or will you join the ranks of victims of your own inertia?